Although the Boston Celtics fell short of reaching their ultimate goal last season of winning an NBA championship and being the first team to win back-to-back championships since the Golden State Warriors did it in the 2017 and 18 NBA Finals, this Boston Celtics team has had a ton of overhaul and change to their roster, and they've had new ownership come in this offseason, and I am joined by a great friend and colleague of mine, Noa Dalzell. Now, many of you know Noa Dalzell is a Celtics blog writer based in Boston who's entering year 3 of her time covering the Celtics. She's particularly focused on off-court storylines and player features while covering the team in person. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to jump right into that conversation with Noa, and I hope you guys all enjoy. Hey, Noa, good morning. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with me here today.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me.
So before we go ahead and we start, diving in and talking about the Celtics offseason, which you guys have had a crazy busy offseason, that is no news to you. I just want to go ahead and just briefly take a moment because you've been somebody who has used your platform and you've been extremely outspoken. You've been an activist in the community, helping all of these families out in Gaza, especially with the tragedies that are continuing to go on. If you just want to take a moment to explain what you've been able to do, how the community's been able to help support that, and just I can get everybody directed to your relief efforts.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'll be brief, but effectively, I think myself, like many other people, have just been increasingly, disturbed, concerned with what's going on with innocent people in Gaza. And for a long time, I was just donating in private because that is easier because you don't have to deal with backlash. You don't have to worry about people getting upset at you. And actually, I'm from Israel. I don't know if you know that, but I was actually born there. And so,
I did not know
yeah,
that.
so it's an extra wrinkle here in my
Wow.
efforts that my dad played professional basketball there. My dad's American, but I was born there. He was playing pro basketball there. So I knew that beginning to kind of take this publicly was going to cause even more backlash for me because of just like my links to the country. But in a sense, I also think that there's an impact to being from Israel and being able to still, think this is a really important issue. And so, yeah, I've been raising money for direct aid efforts in Gaza for the last few months on a more public level. And honestly, like, I didn't think I didn't want to like virtue signal and be like, oh, like I'm donating to this. I was thinking like, what's a good way for me to do it? So I was the first couple $1,000s I was doing donation matching, which is like a really impactful way for people to think, okay, if I donate $1, she's gonna match it, so like I should donate. And then since then we've launched like a bigger aid effort called the Olive of Gaza, which people can read more about. I can share a link, but effectively I have somebody in a Palestinian student who's also a journalism student, honestly very similar to us, like had similar aspirations, who has just been donating, who has been basically taking the money that we donated to him and doing water distributions, flour distributions, all of that. So it's grown into a community effort from one family really at the beginning, and we've raised like probably more than $20,000 in the last month just using NBA Twitter, using just my Twitter platform, which I had no idea was going to be so powerful. So very grateful for people's willingness to kind of prioritize this humanitarian effort.
I think that's actually the perfect way to summarize it, and we won't be too long-winded with it. But first of all, I had no idea you were born in Israel, so to kind of have that connection, I thought was interesting. But just the humanitarian aspect of this too, right? At the end of the day, I think that we're all people, and we all want to see each other survive and do well and strive for the betterment of humanity and society. So I think what you've been doing is absolutely incredible. I love to see that it's continued to make an impact, not just here. What me and you do with our work, but it's continued to spread and that we can continue to make a positive impact out there on other people. So I will absolutely have all of her links to the relief efforts and everything that you guys can do to continue to support these families out there in Gaza, everything through Noa. So that way we can go out there and continue to just make a positive impact on people's lives. Now, kind of transitioning into the Boston Celtics, who you guys have obviously had a very crazy offseason. You are absolutely not surprised at all. From new ownership, all of the free agency losses and additions, we're going to talk about all of that. And I do want to talk about, first and foremost, just really with free agency, what you guys lost out on. Obviously, J.D. Davidson is somebody that me and you have spoke glowingly about plenty of in the past, both very fond of the G League. He obviously signed with the Houston Rockets. You guys lost out on players like Luke Cornett, and Al Horford is still an unrestricted free agent, Miles Norris, and a handful of others. Just kind of take me through what free agency in terms of the losses has looked like for you guys.
Yeah, I think so. After Drew Holiday and Porzingis were traded, it was clear that I don't think this team was going to like contend for a championship next season. Some might say as soon as Tatum went down, that became the case. I do think that there was a lot left even without him, but you lose those two guys. I would have loved to see them keep either Luke or Al or both, because I think they're both winning players. They're both great culture guys. But from a financial standpoint, like, it was going to be tough. And I think for Al in particular, like, he wants to win another title. He wants to, who knows how many years he has left, 1, 2, maybe 3 in his career. And so Al, reportedly is heading to Golden State, not officially yet. But Luke, I thought maybe there was going to be a chance for them to retain him. But obviously he signs a pretty big deal with San Antonio, which I think was more for financial reasons, but there might have been on-court things as well, like maybe a bigger opportunity down the road. I don't know. But yeah, those were kind of the two big losses. And then they signed basically a bunch of minimum players in turn. And I don't know if any of those guys are going to become impactful. Luka Garza, Josh Minot, both were pretty much out of the rotation in Minnesota last year, but you never know when things might change. And then also Chris Boucher, I thought that was a pretty nice signing later on in the summer. But definitely downgrades on paper, at least, and we'll see if any of those guys really materialize to become high impact players.
Yeah, I think Chris Boucher was actually like my favorite signing that you guys had from just the minimalistic signings that you guys had. I selfishly wanted him in Orlando. I thought that he was going to be a perfect complementary fit to what Orlando was building. But I want to know about JD Davidson, though, really quickly. I know he's
Yeah.
obviously somebody that you've covered a ton of with your time with the Maine Celtics. And obviously, he rose up into a G League MVP. We got to see him just absolutely dominate the game this year. What did you make of him signing with the Houston Rockets? And just kind of talk to me about JD Davidson.
Yeah, I was like disproportionately bummed about this one. I think the average Celtics
Yeah.
supporter maybe wasn't as engaged in the storyline, but as you know, JD Davidson
Right.
was the best player in the G League last year. Was just awesome. Like, not just that he put up numbers, but facilitating, like actually leading to winning. As the franchise's all-time leader in points, steals, and assists. So really a legend in Maine. And he had done the 3 consecutive two-way contracts with the Celtics, which is the most that any player has ever done. And that's the limit. You can't do more than 3 two-ways with one organization. And so he was going to be on a standard deal this upcoming year. But once they didn't guarantee it, it was a non-guaranteed contract. I started thinking, okay, maybe they're just going to waive him if he gets another opportunity with a two-way with another team. So he does get that two-way offer with the Rockets. I'm sure he would have rather be on a standard deal. Like, that's been the goal for a long time, but he doesn't get that in Boston. And I don't love this fit for him just because Houston already has so much depth. Like, you saw guys like Cam Whitmore like barely get off the bench. So I would have rather see him go somewhere like Drew Peterson, who was another two-way player for the last 2 seasons. He signed with the Hornets, also a two-way, but it's like in Charlotte, there's like I can see more of a pathway forward because they just don't have the depth.
Correct.
So to me, Houston's going to be like another Boston where they have a lot of good guards. They're contending for a championship. And I don't really know what the pathway is, but obviously like better that than not having any offer. But yeah, I was bummed they didn't take a flyer on him just because I think we've seen a lot in the G League that has been great, but he hasn't been great on the court in NBA minutes, but they've been so limited that I'm not going to draw too many conclusions. But maybe in practice or behind the scenes, what they're seeing is that he doesn't translate to that next level as much as you would hope.
Yeah, and I think that's a totally fair point. So especially with a lot of undersized guards or even guys that continue to go out there and dominate the G League. Me and you have seen just how much of a different stylistically game it is in the G League, just the way that these guys go out there and compete. But one other addition I do want to talk about just very briefly before we kind of move on to the next topic is with Anthony Simons. That was a very interesting pick swap because you talked about Drew Holiday and Kristaps Porzingis, the Celtics trying to get under that second apron. And this was now just kind of another lateral move. You get an Anthony Simons, who's a young, 26-year-old, a bucket getter, but obviously doesn't come with that championship pedigree and just kind of that veteran experience that you'd like to get out of Drew Holiday. What kind of impact can Celtics fans realistically expect from a player like Anthony Simons now coming into this new system? And is there any chance that, he's really here throughout, the full remainder of his last year on his contract?
I think there's a chance because he's on an expiring deal, and I don't know if they're going to prioritize extending him. It seems like it's pretty likely that at some point he'll be traded. Like, I didn't think in late August he would still be on the roster. So when they first acquired him, I thought to myself, okay, don't get too invested in him as a character on this team because he's probably just an expiring contract they're going to try to flip. That type of player, as you've seen, has not had a huge market this offseason. Like the Colin Sextons of the world, even Norman Powell, these guys that are bucket getters. There's just they're not as valued right now as they have been in the past. And so because of that, he's almost been like a non-factor in discussions around next year's team. I think a lot of people expect him to be traded, and a lot of people are just like, oh, he has no value. The reality is, though, if he is on the roster, he could be a 20-point per game guy easily. He averaged 19.3 points per game for his career. He averaged 90 points per game. He started each of the last 3 seasons, every single game. So this is a very high utility score. It's just I don't know if they're going to actually keep him around. But if they do, like, don't be surprised if he ends up being one of the best players on this roster, at least on the offensive end. So I'm curious to see what's going to happen. But obviously, like, we're less than a month away from training camp now. So I'm increasingly, I don't want to say optimistic because I don't really care one way or another. But I'm increasingly thinking that he actually might be on the roster, at least to begin the season. Maybe he gets dealt before the deadline.
Yeah, and I think that Anthony Simons, kind of like what I had mentioned earlier, I think this is just a low risk, high reward
Yeah.
opportunity. At 26 years of age, comes to obviously a culture with championship pedigree. And I think that, in my opinion, from the outside looking in, although you have the defensive liabilities, I think that he's actually a perfect complementary fit alongside Derek White, Jaylen Brown, and even in the return of Jayson Tatum, assuming that, he plays out his contract, he gets another, extension with the Boston Celtics, and he's here for another 2 or 3 years. I really could see Anthony Simons being that point guard in that backcourt that really could help just alleviate some of that pressure off of guys like Tatum, Brown, and White. But, of course, we're projecting. We'll have to continue to see how everything continues to pan out. But I do want to briefly mention the draft. I know that you guys obviously had drafted a ton of players. I believe it was 2 in the second round. You guys had Hugo Gonzalez in the first and then traded George Niang and a couple second rounders to Utah in exchange for RJ Lewis. I thought that RJ Lewis surprisingly went undrafted. I thought he played extremely well at St. John's. And even if you guys did give up quote unquote a lot to go ahead and get RJ, I think that's a player that actually showed a ton of promise in the Big East last year, and I actually like the upside for. So how are Celtics fans really feeling about Hugo and just the way that the draft kind of came together for the Celtics?
Yeah, I think Hugo's one of those guys that, because he's really young and raw and like didn't average anything in Spain last year. Like if you look at his Real Madrid stats, he averaged like 2 points a game or something like that. People were really confused at first. Like they were like, "Who is this guy? Like why did they draft him over like some of these more well-known bigs like the Ryan Kalkbrenners of the world that I think people were eyeing at that point late in the first round?" But then you hear people say, like Javoni say, like, "Oh, this is one of the steals of the draft." So it becomes like, okay, who is this guy? I thought he struggled in summer league for the most part, but in a way where you kind of expect a 19-year-old who has very little experience really to look. And I don't really read too much into summer league anyways because you can see guys dominate summer league and become irrelevant 3 years later, and guys struggle and become MVP players. So it just there's only so much to take from it, but he's definitely the guy that has the most buzz around him because he has that first round pick. Amari Williams, Max Shulga, I think those are kind of your classic two-way players where they have like something they do really well, but they're not complete players, or else they would have been earlier than late second rounders. And then RJ Lewis, yeah, interesting one because I didn't expect him to go undrafted, and I don't think that trade was like they wanted him so bad that they were willing to give up so much for him. I think it was an opportunity to get off the Niang contract, which I don't think they really wanted. That was just a way to get off Porzingis' contract. So for them, it was just a way to pick up a potentially promising player, and get rid of the Porzingis contract without worrying too much about like losing too many picks. And when they traded a couple seconds for that one. But yeah, I agree with you. I think I probably have more upside for him over Max Shulga and Amari Williams. Just given like what he was already. I always like to look at like what did the player actually do in college. And the guys that actually put up numbers, and obviously he struggled late in March Madness, but there's definitely a ceiling there. So 4 rookies is a lot of rookies for the Celtics, more than they've had in previous seasons.
Correct.
But it kind of fits where they're at right now as an organization to have more of those guys that are kind of scratching the potential opportunity ladder.
Yeah, and I think it's exactly what it is. You just get a group of young guys, especially in a year that many would consider a gap year, something that we'll talk about at the very end of the video in terms of Peyton Pritchard and your article and interview with him. But probably the biggest change for the Celtics this offseason has not been anything that we've mentioned so far, but more so with the new ownership. $6.1 billion in terms of Celtics new ownership. What was that whole just experience like, right? From just new ownership coming in, just the energy around the arena and just really around the city. Like, just kind of walk me through that.
Yeah, I think like it was weird because the team wins the championship, but then like a couple weeks later they're in the midst of extending Jayson Tatum, Sam Hauser, Derek White, and it's just like all good news across the board. They re-signed Kada and Cornette and Tillman, like everybody comes back, everybody's extended, and then in the middle of all those transactions, you hear that this really well-liked ownership group is up for sale. And it kind of makes you wonder, like, is that why they're extending everybody? Because they're not going to pay this payroll? Like, I don't know. But, I think a lot of people thought that Steve Pagliuca, who was a longtime minority owner of the team, was going to get that bid. And ultimately, Bill Chisholm, who nobody had ever heard of, was not in the basketball scene, gets selected. And he's a completely new character. So I've met him. He seems like a nice guy. He's very in tune with the Celtics world. He watches our podcasts. You can tell he's like a real fan. But at the same time, nobody really knows if he is going to kind of be willing to spend and invest in this team the same way that Wick Grosbeck has been able to. And this year is kind of a tough year to evaluate him because on one hand, yes, they're shedding payroll, but probably any owner would have. So it's hard to know in a vacuum. Like it's not like he came in and just blew up the team for no reason. Like I think this was probably inevitable. But the next few years, we'll get a better sense of what he's like and if the same kind of philosophies the Celtics have had. They've been one of the teams that's willing to go in the second apron, willing to spend, willing to invest. Like they've been up there with kind of the best of them. And so anything below that is going to be a step back for Celtics fans.
Yeah, and I think what you said actually kind of bridged me into my next point because you talk about the fact that most owners, especially those that are really trying to compete, are willing to kind of go into that second apron. And then obviously this year, now with the absence of Jayson Tatum, there's expected regression, obviously, with the team. And you mentioned earlier, championship aspirations may or may not have kind of gone out the window the moment he got hurt in the conference semifinals. So now, in the absence of Jayson Tatum, what have you seen? Because we've seen some social media posts where he's kind of walking around, he's rehabbing a little bit. What have you or have you not heard in terms of his progression with his rehab? How do you think that he's kind of continued to come along? And, how can we continue to see this Celtics team look without Tatum this upcoming season?
Yeah. He looks good in the rehab. I'm honestly kind of surprised that like in August he can be dancing around at a wedding, but then he can't it's unlikely that he'll play basketball in March. But I guess that's just like shows you how high impact NBA basketball is, that like those two milestones are so far apart from one another. So he probably won't play next season just because if you look at like long-term outcomes, like that's the better outcomes are the guys that have missed more time, and he's young and has a long career ahead of him, and they're going to prioritize his long-term well-being over like rushing him back for a season that they might not even be in the playoff mix at that point. Like who knows? But it's not off the table, and they haven't ruled him out. Like Halliburton's been ruled out for next season. They have not ruled him out, and knowing what I know about him, like I do think that he's going to make every attempt to come back next year. He hates missing games. He would miss it, he sprain his ankle and try to come back the next game, and it would be for no reason.
Yes.
Like stuff like that. Like so.
I mean, look at the Orlando series.
Yeah, exactly.
How banged up he got. Right.
So we'll see what happens there, but certainly, like, look, everything I've been hearing has been positive about his rehab. Like, it seems like he has been hitting all those milestones. And then the big thing was he had that surgery, like, literally the night of, or like the early morning after rupturing that Achilles, which is unusual to do. And I went through and looked at all the players that have had that procedure, and like that's puts him at an advantage as well. So we'll see. Hopefully, he doesn't lose too much from his game. We're coming off this injury, but it is kind of wild, like how many NBA players are rehabbing from a torn Achilles right now. Like he was just hanging out with DeJounte Murray, who I forgot also was just a couple months ahead of him on that one.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about DeJounte, Damian, Tyrese Halliburton, like all these players, and then obviously famously and notoriously Kevin Durant in those 2019 finals, right? I think that the better situation is to prioritize JT's long-term health, not rush him back to the court. And you kind of even mentioned it there that, Boston may or may not even be in the playoff mix at that point of the year once you start getting towards the middle of March. So what can Celtics fans and what can NBA fans really anticipate and should expect from a Jayson Tatum-less team? Like how good can JB and Derek White be as your two best players for a full 82 game season?
Yeah, I think it's going to come down to like there's a lot of different individual outcomes that have a range. So Jaylen Brown could be hampered by this knee thing that he dealt with last year and struggle with the fact that now he's the primary scoring option and all the attention's on him. Or he could show I'm an MVP caliber player. I don't know. Could anywhere on that spectrum is possible. Like Derek White's been very durable. If he's able to play in all 82 games again, like that's a big plus. Guys like Peyton Pritchard, how is he going to be as a starting point guard? The front court, like I've been watching Nemias Queta and Eurobasket. He looks incredible for Portugal, but how much of that is going to translate to being an NBA starter, right? Because we've seen him in really limited stretches. So like this is one of the most like unknown teams in my eyes of like where they're going to be, because there is a world where the Celtics are the third seed next year. Like that sounds crazy to say, but like I can actually like if you're thinking about the most positive outcomes for each of these individual things, like it's possible. There's also a world where they're like the second worst team in the Eastern Conference, and I don't know which world we live in, but it kind of makes this season intriguing. And they're gonna have to stay really healthy. Like that's the big thing. That in the past they've been able to afford guys missing 3 games, 4 games, 20 games because they have so much depth. And this year, if Kata goes down and misses 3 months with a bad ankle sprain or something, like that's a problem, right? And so they need everybody to be available, and that's always a risky way to start a season because it's NBA basketball and we know guys get injured all the time.
Yeah, I think that somewhere where I would lean just from the outside looking is that Boston's somewhere in between that middle. I'm not sure that I guess in a perfect
Yeah.
scenario, they could go all the way up to 3. I think Joe Mazzulla and this team is still too talented to kind of fall towards the bottom of the Eastern Conference. I'd probably lean somewhere into that play-in mix, maybe somewhere 8 to 10 range. I think that's more realistic just from what I anticipate this team to look like. But the last point I kind of want to leave you with, and I think a player that doesn't get talked about enough and maybe necessarily underperformed to standards last year, but I think has a real opportunity now with more minutes, right, and more of an opportunity in this Joe Mazzulla team is Xavier Tillman. Was really just kind of like that big-bodied, guy that just kind of brings a certain mentality coming over from Memphis. And I know a ton of Celtics fans were extremely excited about the fact that you guys landed Tillman, and like I said, maybe didn't have that level of opportunity last year. What do you maybe make of the way that Xavier played last season, and then what do you kind of expect from Tillman this upcoming season?
Yeah, I think something that kind of flew under the radar is that he was a little banged up. Like he had an off-season knee procedure entering last season, and then he had some like injections throughout the year. So I don't know like where his knee issues lie. Like it's not something that's been like heavily discussed, but I think that was the source of like some of his struggles was just like he was playing through a knee issue, and then he has had long-term knee issues, so it's nothing new. I also think he just lost his confidence. Like when he was on the floor, like he was passing up open threes and dribbling into traffic, and it's like he knows better than that. So I still think that the guy in there that helped them win the title, that had those massive moments in Game 3 of the finals, like that guy still exists. It's just can he be healthy and can he kind of regain that mojo a little bit? So I don't have like a ton of expectations for him, but he's been pretty much forgotten when we discuss like what the front court rotation looks like next year, and so it is very much possible that he ends up being one of the more reliable guys. And we kind of forgot about him because he fell so out of the mix last
Mhm.
season. But I think health was more of a factor than people realized.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if he can get back to health, he's going to continue to be back to that player that you once mentioned. And last question I'm going to leave you with, because I think this is probably the most important question I'm going to ask you all day. In the absence of Jayson Tatum, is this the year that Peyton Pritchard makes the All-Star game?
This is a great opportunity for him. Like, I don't know if it's
Mhm.
going to happen because it's really hard. Like, you go through, guys have elite seasons all the time and are not named all stars. But I could see if this team does really well next season, like exceeds expectations, they're probably going to get granted 2 all stars. And Peyton Pritchard, if he's averaging 20 points a game and 8 assists on high efficiency and defends well, like he could be in that conversation. So we'll see. I've long believed that that's a ceiling, but I never thought that it could happen in Boston. And because of the kind of all the different things that have happened here, like he actually might get that opportunity playing for the Celtics, which would be really exciting. So we'll see. I had a great conversation with him last weekend. He doesn't care if he's going to start. He doesn't care, what his role is going to be. He just wants to like impact winning, and I think that's always been his mindset. And yeah, he's one of the reasons why I do have a little bit of optimism for next season, maybe more than most, because I think that his ceiling is potentially really high.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, if there's ever a hill that you're going to die on, I think that is absolutely the perfect hill to die on. You called it well over a year ago, and
Yeah.
I think that Peyton Pritchard is a phenomenal player. So definitely looking forward to his campaign and the way the Celtics perform this upcoming season. In mentioning that article, I will also go ahead and I will link down below the relief efforts to Gaza. I will link all of Noah's socials down below, including her most recent article that she had just did one-on-one with Peyton Pritchard in regards to if the Celtics are going to be playing a gap year. Noah, thank you so much for taking the time, and I look forward to watching your coverage for the rest of the season.
Awesome. Thank you.